I'm just going to introduce all three of our panellists very quickly and then hand over to them to share their reflections with you. So first of all, we've got Gail Pacheco. Gail is a Professor of Economics and Director of the New Zealand Policy Research Institute at AUT. She has extensive experience leading large-scale multi-institutional funded projects, and evidence of her impact is showcased by receipt of the NZIER Economics Award in 2018 and the AUT Medal in 2019. Now, a lot of you are probably aware that she has also just been appointed as the next Equal Employment Opportunities Commissioner at the Human Rights Commission. Well done to Gail. Next up we have Tia Dawes. Now, I wrote Tia's bio for him and he's now very worried about what I'm going to say. Tia is a senior researcher with Rangahau. Over the past 6 years, he's been involved in research looking at kaumātuatanga and the well-being of our kaumātua. His research recognises the central role of kaumātua in knowledge production and the preservation of mātauranga within Māori communities. Welcome, Tia. And finally, for the session, we have the wonderful Pauline Gulliver. Pauline is the Relationships and Engagement Manager for the National Mortality Review Function. She previously supported the Family Violence Death Review Committee, and prior to this was an academic with a specialist interest in violence against women. She will be speaking from a family violence homicide perspective. So welcome, Gail. Kia ora. You don't need that, you can just speak here. It's just that one front.
Oh, thank you for that welcome. And always when I come up to speak, I've always got to bring the mic down a little bit. Today I just wanted to talk a little bit about a project that we've been doing and how that's shaped our understanding in terms of thinking about this issue. I've been co-leading a project along with Denise Wilson, a Professor of Māori Health at AUT, on the prevalence of abuse of older people over the last 8-9 months. So this is obviously a really complex social issue. So what we did was we put together a rather large team which covers a number of different disciplines, as you can tell from the slide, and across a number of different institutions. So we've got people in AUT, we've got people in University College Dublin, people at the University of Auckland as well, across these institutions, and we've got economics. I'm an economist. Please don't hold that against me. There's health, there's biostats, we've got quantitative, qualitative, international frameworks, New Zealand frameworks. We've put it all together. And I think you need all those different perspectives. It's not the sort of policy issue that one discipline can solve or can think about. That one framework can be used. It needs to have a range of different ones. And I thought that's the first important point I wanted to make. The second point was we needed a definition, an overarching definition to guide us through in terms of our research. And so we surveyed the literature and we landed on this one, which is taken from the Australian study that looked at abuse of older people. So I'll just read it slowly in case and it's not in the slides, sorry, I edited it last night, so if you're looking at the paper versions in front of you. So it's a single or repeated act or failure to act, including threats that results in harm or distress to an older person. And these occur when there's an expectation of trust and or where there is a power imbalance between the party responsible and the older person. So that's the overarching definition we're using, and I think the second sentence is the really important part there. We're really looking at where there's that expectation of trust or where there's that power imbalance. We're not talking about stranger abuse and things like that. So that is based from the Australian study and is the one we're using as a kind of our main definition to guide us. Our study is focused on those aged over 55. And living in the community, not in rest homes. Not because we don't think that's important, but because that would need another kind of whole scope, because it's quite a different space to look at, but it's also a very important space to look at. So what's our approach? Where, as I said, it's a complex social issue. We're looking at it 3 different ways. So one is using the IDI, the Integrated Data Infrastructure, which is administrative data, and I'll explain each of these in a minute. The second is doing a national prevalence survey, and the third is we're doing some qualitative deep dives, and then we're going to combine all the information together. So first, using the IDI, this is administrative data, if you aren't aware, the Integrated Data Infrastructure. It provides really just a subset of information on the abuse of older people. And it's probably thought of best in terms of the extreme end in terms of prevalence. It's only going to give you some information. So for instance, in terms of assaults on people aged over 55, it's only going to give you assaults that were reported in the police data, or it's only going to give you assaults that ended up in hospital. It's not going to give you ones that didn't end up in either of those databases. Okay? So it's going to provide an underestimate of the likely prevalence rate, but at least it's data that's there already that we can use. We can at least make use of it and see what it gives us. Plus, it's data that's only collected for a subset of people in some cases. So for instance, the inter-RI home assessment has flags for suspected abuse and neglect, but those are only in terms of those who get an inter-RI assessment, right? And they tend to be much older and more vulnerable members of our community, so they're going to be a subset of the population. And this data is not going to capture some of the other forms of abuse we want to know about, like financial abuse. There's no administrative data on that. Okay? But this gives us one perspective. Okay? And that's one way we're thinking about well-being of older people in terms of what does the admin data tell us? What can we learn from that? The second way we're looking at this is with a national prevalence survey. So this is the first national prevalence survey that we're doing in New Zealand. Remember that we're interested in harm or mistreatment caused by someone the older person knew. So the idea here is that relationship of trust or that potential power imbalance. So we're focused on several categories of harm as defined by the World Health Organization. And I think one thing that's really important to note is we don't mention the term abuse in the survey at all. Okay? We talk about whether you got the help you needed. We ask those sort of questions. We ask whether you were harmed financially, for instance. We never use the term abuse throughout the survey. And so we've already done a pilot version of the survey, and it's launching in field shortly. The other thing we're doing in this survey is, in addition to sort of the categories that the World Health Organization usually define, we're also collecting information on cultural and spiritual abuse, which hasn't really been done before. Only the Australian survey has collected this information, and they only did it for those who don't speak, where English isn't their native language. And so we're doing it across the whole sample, collecting it for everyone. We're doing it more comprehensively. And we're looking at things that disrespect or harms related to culture, language, spirituality. So not letting you practice your religion, or deliberately mistranslating from your preferred language. Those sort of harms as well. So that's the first time that's really been comprehensively done internationally. And then the third area that we're looking at is qualitative deep dives. So in this space, we're looking at 4 different communities: Māori, Pacific, European, disabled. I've got a disabled lead here. And we're collecting contextual narratives to sit alongside the data we're getting from the administrative information plus the survey. So you need all those components together, in my view, to get all the different perspectives. Now, the language we use here depends on the context we're thinking about it. So when we're recruiting for the deep dives, we use particular language because there's particular terms that are well known, like elder abuse, and that seemed to resonate when recruiting. But when we're in the deep dives, we're much more flexible in terms of the language that's used. That's up to the sort of participants to lead the discussion and how we think about this issue. Whether it's in focus groups, wānanga, talanoa, etc., it's up to the group to lead that discussion in that space. And what's not shown in this picture is we're also doing financial deep dive. And this is the first time in New Zealand that we're collecting data and insights held by professionals in the finance industry. Because there's no consistency across institutions in terms of how instances of financial abuse are measured or recorded currently. So that's another area of deep dive we're also doing. So hopefully in sort of explaining each of these components, I've given sort of a little bit of a glimpse, a little bit of, of the surface in terms of how we've got these different perspectives and each of them is shaping not just the language we're using, but how we're thinking about capturing, measuring, and understanding our perspectives on well-being for older people. And if you want to know a little bit more about the study that's ongoing, sorry it's so small, I didn't realize, but you've got the notes in front of you. There's the website, which will give you some more information about the study. And thank you.
It's not long enough. Ko te tōtai, e mihi ana ki kingi tuheitia, ka mihi ka tangi, e mihi ki tōna whānau, ki te waka o tainui. Moi mai i te rangatira, moi mai oki mai rā. Ngā mihi kia koe tama, moto mihi kia mātou, ngā mihi kia koutou katoa. So my name is Tia. I'm one of the researchers with Rangahau, and I've been involved in a project together with Gravitas OPG. So we were commissioned by MSD to look at cultural perspectives of abusive older people. So, we were looking at how is abuse of older people experienced, how is it understood, how is it discussed. So the research has been developed in two streams. So we have a tangata whenua stream and a tangata tiriti. So when we were talking about this day, when we were asked to speak, we were asked to talk about things that we could raise, questions that we might raise regarding this particular subject. So I'm just going to touch today on one of our research questions, which kind of raises questions, certainly raises questions for us. And that is, how is AOP conceived or understood? So we've spoken with about 40 participants. So these are, most of these were kaumātua kuia from across Auckland. We did have a group from the far north, a very remote group. We spoke with kaiarahi within whānau order providers, and we spoke with some carers. Many of those were also kaumātua. So what I can say about that is that we are nowhere near saturation. Every new hui that we go into raises new points of interest, new topics. So just to return to that question, how was AOP conceived and understood? So the term elder abuse as this overarching concept is neither used nor understood. So within our group sessions, we have wānanga with our participants. Participants were quick to list a number of things that were considered harmful to them. But no one discussed elder abuse as an overarching, no one discussed it under an overarching term. Now, we had one participant talk about, we don't have a word for that. We had some tentative suggestions around what could be used, whakaiti te mana, patu, ill treatment. But often, those terms are very nuanced, and they often refer to specific circumstances, so they're talking about something specific. Not only did people not use the term, but there could be a real strong aversion to hearing it. And I still remember using the word abuse with a queer, and I saw her face screw up, and I'm still cringing. And it's just like a moment that I would like to take back. So what I would say is that, this term abuse is not resonating with our participants. I think we used abuse on our information sheet, and one of our kaumātua said, "I saw that and I didn't want to come to this." Now we know some of the reasons why people don't like it. It's in the literature. There's fear of repercussion. There could be feeling hakama. Could be protective of whānau. We also heard how a lot of harm was unintentional. So unintentional harm was understood as a result of pressure on carers. So we heard lots about caregiving. This is a cultural particularity perhaps, this expectation to care for your whānau, to care for your older people. There was a lot of comment around feeling judged. So if we're thinking about the term abuse, or even using it, it's limiting. I don't mean to use it all the time, but it limits inquiry and interventions that could be effective in addressing these types of harm that we're familiar with. Now, the view wasn't universal, but it did recur repeatedly. So when talking about harm to older people, there was a tendency among many to reframe the language positively. So by that I mean, one person said, it's not elder abuse, it's elder care. So we ask about abuse. What we hear in return is words like awhi, aroha, manaakitanga, kawa. We heard that it should be about tikanga. So again, there's something here that's reinforcing the emphasis, that's emphasising having a strong Māori identity and the forms of connection that support Māori. So within that context, we hear a lot about care. And it's all linked with that kind of laying blame. The care, those traditional structures that support Māori, that support whānau Māori. We heard often how those structures have been undermined by government policy. We'll be familiar with a lot of that kind of stuff. But I do want to emphasise how it was a language of care, not a language of abuse that came up across our groups. Now, our partner group, OPG, is finding similar things with some of the other ethnic groups. I talked with a Chinese interviewer in that group, and I know Mary's doing work in that space. But she raised comments within her group about how the term abuse is not understood. She said it was a very westernised term, which just did not make sense to her participants. And she's right. The term abuse is deeply embedded in a Western tradition. It's a Latin word, abutor, the past participle is abusus. Which is almost you can translate it as how we would translate abuse now. So I just want to circle back and just reiterating my point that this term abuse is just not resonating with people. We know that it's notoriously difficult to define. But we end up with either a shopping list or quite a technocratic definition of what elder abuse is. And because it's not understood very well, our older Māori are not able to articulate what interventions could be supportive. Or, actually, no, a better way of saying that is, Māori understand among themselves what those supports are. But it's certainly limiting our ability to reach whānau. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa.
Morena koutou. Interestingly, we were all the same height on Zoom. Kia ora, morena. So I am speaking to you. I had some slides. Oh, there you go. I'm speaking to you from a mortality review perspective, which sounds as though it would be really depressing, but actually where I want to go to is about ageing well. It's about flipping it on its head and thinking about life transitions and how we navigate life in all its uniqueness. And I want to start this with a quote from Lisa Carrington, oddly enough, at the ripe old age of 35, who said, "During the Olympics, you don't realise how much your identity is wrapped up in winning until you don't win." And, you know, clearly she won a lot. But it struck me that it's something that we see a lot in our data. So we review homicide events. And a lot of the time, what we see is the transitions of life create a state of vulnerability in one way or another. So it's the transitions of moving from being a young woman to being a young mother, the transition of going from marriage to being single, the transition of working to not working, so moving through different life stages. And those different life stages also carry some form of identity with them. And in our 7th report, which is what this figure is taken from, we tried to explore those different life stages and what those sorts of things meant. And we looked at chronic health conditions and intrafamilial violence. So that's where you have violence that's perpetrated by either adult children on parents or siblings or those sorts of things. And what we found is that actually an age definition doesn't necessarily serve us well, because people can migrate those life transitions very, very differently depending on where they are in society. So if you have a person with a chronic health condition and that chronic health condition's existed either their whole life or their adult life, then one of the features of your life is being known to services. So you have a characteristic that services capture within their records about who you are. You might be a difficult patient or somebody who doesn't engage. And that moves forward with you. So when you get to a point in your life where you're particularly vulnerable, irrespective of what your age is, that creates a situation where you're at particular high risk. Which led us to the perspective that actually we need to start thinking about people and who they are in their current place in their life course, irrespective of what that age is. We also found in our data that actually some of homicide events that happen when people are older happen as a reflection of ongoing care of other family members over a long period of time. seeking support for that ongoing care and not necessarily getting the support that is needed. So the family ends up carrying the care. So you might reach out for disabled people, you might reach out for people with chronic mental health illnesses, and you don't get the support that you need. And after a period of time, your ability to maintain that care reduces. And that's where we see our homicide events. It's not something that we think is helpful in any way, shape or form, but it is a feature of what we see. And so we see older people both as victims and as offenders, but not necessarily as an offender. I think you said it, where there was an intent behind it, but actually just a collapse in the ability to maintain that care for an ongoing period of time. So from our Kiri Matiatos is just sitting there in the green. Michael Ragusky is in the dark blue t-shirt, I think. Yep. So both Michael and Kiri are from the Family Violence Death Review Committee, Family Violence Subject Matter Experts. I'm going to disappear after this, but they will still be here, so they can answer your questions. But so I'm going to say from my perspective, and I hope that this perspective is shared by them as well, tight definitions haven't really served us particularly well. What we've seen is that while tight definitions are really good for research, they help you to define what you're looking at, that you are able to paint a picture for people who are reading that research, it really, really narrowly defines the condition that you're looking at, and that was just mentioned previously as well. It encourages a very, very siloed response. And it means that we focus on the individual rather than their family or their whānau that they're existing within. And it's that family, that whānau dynamic that really creates either a supportive environment or an environment that puts people at risk of violence. Definitions also really useful for policy development because you get to tell people how you're spending your money, but this is what they create. They create a condition where you have people who have to navigate a system. So we now have navigators, a lot of navigators in this country, and the reason we have navigators in the system is because we've created a system that requires navigators to progress people through it. So this particular slide, again, it's taken from our 7th report, but the reason we developed this slide was because we'd undertaken an in-depth review of a person who was in their late 50s, who'd had chronic health conditions for her entire life, but she was in a place that she did not fit into any of our nice, neat silos for help. As a result, she fell through every single crack that we could create, and she ended up one of our statistics. And the person that killed her was her main caregiver, who never should have been holding that responsibility. And so my question for you then is, who was the actual offender in that case? Was it the person who we ended up prosecuting and sending to jail? Or was it our services who never effectively responded, who labelled and stigmatised her, and who discharged her when she said time and time again, I don't feel safe? So that's I'm going to stop there. I don't have any definitions. I've not provided a useful solution there. Sorry.
I'll give you back your glasses and your notebook and your microphone for those. Thank you so much. Already feeling challenged to think differently, which is really what today is all about. We have some time for some question and answers from our panellists before we head into thinking about some of these challenges within our tables. I'm just going to swivel slightly so I'm kind of looking at you guys. Do we have roving mic? We have a roving microphone over here and over here, so if people could pop their hands up, there's a question down here to start us off.
Oh, kia ora koutou. To Gail, Tia and Pauline, that was just awesome, by the way. And I wanted to come back to your definition. I guess it's not so much a question or a comment, but around the state care abuse, and particularly that notion that we've had people who've come through our state care system with an expectation of trust that the state would look after them, physically, mentally, sexually abused, who are now older people, who are now also being neglected. And I wondered, in terms of your, I guess, the meso system, where do you see the responsibility of the state in terms of that trust, expectation of trust to care for older people who've been abused by the state?
Pauline, do you want to take that one first?
Do I do? My suggestion would be that trust no longer exists, because I don't believe you can treat people that way and still expect them to trust you. And my suggestion would be, and again, I haven't canvassed this with my wonderful team over there, but my suggestion would be that actually we need to give that responsibility back to community, because they will be the most effective responders. But in order to do that, we also need to resource it well. And I think that for that group of people, there are going to be ongoing chronic health, mental health issues that need a lot of support.
Kia ora. Gail, Tia, did you have anything you wanted to add to that question? Okay.
I suppose I can add a little bit. When we were talking with our older people, it was often the kōrero revolved around government policy and their long-term impact on whānau. Deep levels of mistrust. Does that fit the definition? Yeah. Is it helpful? Well, it kind of guides us towards community level care. Those whānau know best how to care for themselves. Just deep levels of mistrust.
Kia ora, thank you. There's a question down here.
So I've got a question. Gail, you probably anticipated this and have talked about this with many people, but in terms of Asian and Mala older people facing abuse in our communities, it'd be really interesting if there's any insights you can share on the focus that the research has on that, and also be keen to hear from Tia and Pauline as well, just because there was some research recently commissioned by the Zealand Foundation about abuse, I think among Indian communities and Chinese communities in particular in Tamaki Makaurau, that was done by Dr. Edwina Peer, interviewing service providers from that kind of lens, and looking at high rates of abuse of older persons. So just keen to hear insights on that.
I might even pass back to MSD on this one. So we understand there's another piece of research going on in that space in terms of Asian. Are you covering it as well?
Cultural perspectives.
Yes. So there's, but I believe there's other research as well in this space.
Sorry, probably best if you talk about it, Tia, but I think Sue was going to be here today, but unfortunately wasn't able to make it, from Gravitas. The project that Tia is involved in, there's 5 population groups that are part of that. There's the Kaupapa Māori research, which Rangahau is responsible for the stream of. I think Gravitas is looking after research with Pākehā, Pacific peoples, East Asian and South Asian, and each of those groups has equal sample size. So whilst let's just say it's been a long conversation, and the funding, I think the team is doing as much as they can with what they have.
Yeah. And because we knew that was happening, we didn't include that as a group, but I think it's an equally important group to look at as well.
Sorry, what was the second? Was there a further question for Pauline and Tia in that, or no?
I did have a quick question. So recently there was some funding cuts announced there's around 800 people living in aged residential care who may not have their stay in care supported, I think by whaikaha. So that's a group of people who are disabled under the age of, say, 65, so but maybe 50 plus. Again, I guess a group of marginalised individuals who might be at risk of abuse and other, I guess, harms. So I guess any insights on how to advocate within the complex web that you outlined, Pauline, to ensure that that particular group of people are safe, because there are 800 people nationally, but that's obviously 800 families and, you know, still important, yeah.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch the question.
Just how would you just advocate for more funding so people like that can be in aged residential care, or in order to keep them sort of safe from harm, would you sort of look at maybe other solutions for people who are disabled, who've traditionally been in aged residential care because they need a certain level of care for health reasons?
Yeah, I think it's complex, and that's not the answer that you want. But the reason I give that answer is because we have recently undertaken a review where there was a potential for a younger person to go into aged residential care because of the chronic health conditions they were experiencing, and it was completely inappropriate. That's not to say that residential care wasn't appropriate, but aged residential care wasn't appropriate for that person. So I think the advocacy for residential care is vitally important, for safe residential care is vitally important, and I think that there's definitely a need for a loosening of the age brackets, in part because of the chronic health conditions that we see coming through at different age groups in different communities within New Zealand, right? So when we did COVID vaccinations, for example, we reduced the threshold for Māori and Pacific in an acknowledgement of chronic health conditions and the increased risk that put them at. So that says to us that actually 65 is too high for some communities. And so there's, and yet we still have those thresholds for other things. So all I'm saying is that I think we need to be, to relax our definitions in order to be able to support people better.
Kia ora, thank you. Well, we've got time for one more question before we head into kind of individual workshops.
I have a couple of quick questions. First one, I think in relation to the permanent study. So you mentioned about people age of 55. So if we look at other public, policies, we're talking about older people being 65. So what's the reason of 55, and what does it impact on service delivery if we have more people, start from 55? Another question is around whether the permanent studies look at people who experience self-neglect.
Yeah, so 55, we looked at the literature in this space quite a bit, and initially we were thinking 65, but we also wanted to make sure we included enough Māori and Pacific, where we know, it's already been talked about a few times today, where they've got lower life expectancy, and we need to think about, and we didn't want to have different thresholds for different age groups. One study that we thought was really good in this space was a Canadian study where they did lower the age range they were looking at, particularly because of the Indigenous life expectancy in Canada. And so that's why we thought we will also do the same, focus on 55 plus. Once you've got the data on over 55 plus, you can cut it up in lots of different ways after that. So we can then look at 55 to 64, 65 to 74, etc. And we can then cut it up in a lot of different ways and think about service delivery in different ways as well then. But we wanted to, if this is the first time we're going to capture it, make sure we capture as broad a range as we can and that we're not missing out any groups, particularly because there's already small populations of Māori and definitely of Pacifica, if you look at the census data, who are over 65, over 75. Yeah.
The second part question about self-neglect, whether that's included in your prevalence study?
We're really looking at following that definition in terms of abuse by, or harm or mistreatment by somebody that's known to them that they're in a relationship where there's trust and where there's that power imbalance. So that's really the focus.
Kia ora.
In terms of, because of the research definition that's being used, it wouldn't be within scope of prevalence and the prevalence estimates, but it's likely that, similar to the Australian survey, the survey responses will pick up people who are in a situation of self-neglect, but the actual research definition and then the estimates would not include self-neglect.
Kia ora, thank you. I've just got one big round of applause for all of our panellists.